So now we had walked for 8 hours. We had made the mistake to drink. We had no container for water. That's the one thing that I was not well prepared in. So there was some standing water at one of the farmhouses we passed, and we drank from it, which was a mistake. We were very sick for the next 3 days, but of course we didn't know that, and you cannot do well without water. So we drank it. At the end of the 8 hours, we came to a big intersection, and some of the traffic was stopped. By the way, the traffic was tanks, Russian tanks, going in one direction, and refugees going in the other direction, similar to us. But most of the time, we were pretty much just my mother and I walking. So we got to this big intersection, and my mother sees a relatively small truck, a regular truck, is standing. She looks into the cab and sees a Russian officer, and he looks Jewish to her. And I have no idea what looking Jewish means. I have seen people in my own family. My mother's family was one of 10 children. They had blondes, redheads, and brunettes, and I don't think any of them really looked like Hitler's caricatures of Jews. So what that meant, I never found out. But lo and behold, she was right with this particular major, and she's talking to him. She has no Russian. He doesn't speak German, and anyhow, who wants to hear German at this point, at the end of World War II, after what the Germans had done? So it's the only language she can address him in. And he gets out of his truck and says to her in Yiddish, which is very similar to German. It started as an old German dialect. So in any case, he speaks to her, she understands, and she's trying to prove to him that we are Jewish. And we do have to prove it, because there are no Jews left. We know they're all in concentration camps or killed. Who are you? And so she shows her Jewish passport, a large red J in it. Her name has been changed to Sarah. If you were a man, your name was changed to Abraham. And that's not enough for him. Oh, your husband could, and we heard that later from an OAS man in Berlin, from an American. Your husband might have been a Nazi. He got a hold of this Jewish passport. But my mother has more. She knows the main Jewish, I'd call it a watchword of the Jewish religion. It's the Shema. Hear, O Israel, your God is one. That's the major prayer. And she says it to him in Hebrew. He does understand that and is almost convinced. She also has a picture of her father's tombstone. It's the same maiden name. His name is Lewin, just like her maiden name. And it has a Jewish star on it, and he died in 1937, and it's all on the tombstone. So now he believes her, the three things together, and he says, I can't do much for you, but I'm going to a village, and I'm billeted in a house, and if there's room for you and your daughter, you can come with us. And somehow we managed to get on that truck. It's quite high. And they have supplies on the truck, and one older man with a fearsome mustache, and my mother finds it that way. To me, he looked like somebody's grandfather, but he was from the Asian side of Soviet Union. He was a Tatar, and he had Asian features, and my mother had not seen anyone like that. So, but I'm okay with it. And he gives us something to eat. What does he have on the truck? He has prawns, believe it or not. And after the water we drank, that's the last thing we need, but he means well. He's sharing it with us, and he also gives us a cake of soap. We have blackened our faces with mud to be unattractive, just in case. Anyhow, we arrive in a house which a German doctor had lived in, and he left his mother behind to guard his house. I mean, the idiocy of that. This is now a Polish village, or will be the next day, and he thinks his mother can do some, protect the place. She can't, but there is a room for us, and as I said before, we were sick for 3 days. But after that, the Russian major is interested in my mother, and that's one thing. But then he becomes interested in me, and our good fortune was that at this point, all the officers are called out to a little town. They're preparing for taking Berlin, and we can run away. We can't run very far. Things are still too dangerous in the city, and it's a long walk. So what we do is we run across the street from where we saw that the man who brought us food while we were sick, that's where he came from. It's a excuse me. It's a farm, and there's a silo, and there's a barn, and the Russians have made it their food depot. So one thing we know, we won't starve. He also impressed us as a kind man, and we were right, he is, and he speaks to his comrade, and they leave us alone. He makes himself understood. You have to remember, my mother knows a few Polish words, but no Russian, and I don't speak anything but German, with a little bit of English I learned in school, which won't help me now. So somehow they make themselves understood, and he tells her all he wants her to do is cook for him and his body. And she does, and he gives her 15 eggs. As we have dozens here, we had 15, was a unit of eggs. He gives her 15 eggs and a salami, and she should make a breakfast out of that, and she does. I think they have bread. I think there's bread that somewhere there's a bakery that somebody took over and is making bread. But so she cooks these, and we eat 3 of these eggs and very little salami, and they managed to eat the rest. And they weren't heavy. They were just really hungry because they hadn't had much food for the last 4 years either. And he does save us, because when the officer comes back, he runs up and down the village shooting into the air, and we make up what he's calling for. He's calling for his women. The first night, by the way, we had to hide in the bushes near a brook. But that was for the one night, just in case somebody came back. And when they came back, we were installed, and we didn't go near the windows, and we were safe. We were safe for 2 weeks, because at that point, these Russians are called out. They're marching to Berlin to liberate Berlin for their side. And we realized we are no longer safe. This man, by the way, gave us some food. he gave us a milk can, because what do you do if you find that you can get food, but you have no container? So now we have a milk can, and he gave us a broom, which came in handy later on, but we don't know that. So we put the milk can and a pillowcase he gave us with some bacon of all things. But you know, if there's no food, kashrut no longer matters. It's being kosher, it's called kashrut. And so we put that on the broom. My mother is in front of me and I'm coming behind her, and we carry our stuff on this broom. We also have a little backpack, by the way, which everything of value was stolen from on that first day and around Danzig. Some Russian soldiers took my mother's silk dresses, and from mine they left my clothes, but they took my father's cameras and opened it up, and the film that was, you know, they didn't know what to do with it. They also took everybody's watches. If you saw a caricature of Russian soldiers with their arm full of watches, that was actually true. These were simple people who had not seen those things in their own life back home. So we walked back to Danzig, and now my mother knows we need help. We don't know where to go. She does have one place. The other survivor, she knows where that survivor is, and we do spend the night there. But before we get there, we know she, and maybe some other people who survived, who are in our same situations, Jewish mothers and children, we need help. So she goes to the first building in a suburb of Danzig with a flag, and that's a very nice-looking young man, a Polish officer, and they wore whatever uniforms they could get a hold of, and he's in a Polish Navy uniform. And he says to my mother, the only thing he can do for her is she can share his room, which means sharing his bed. And my mother says, I can have that at any street corner, thank you very much. So he does. He is very helpful. He gives us the name of his commander. The commander of Danzig is a Pole. It's under the Soviet Union still, and all other officers are Russian. But he is the commander of the town itself, who will stay in charge when the Russians leave. So we know where he is. Guess where he is? He is at the Gestapo building. That's where the Polish administration is, because the building was just outside the city and it was preserved. It didn't burn. So we get to this co-worker of my mother's. She is in a kind of cabin in a community garden that she and her husband had, she and her family. And she has 4 little girls. The oldest one is just a year younger than I, but I'm much taller than I am now, because I was a young girl and I was finished growing at 11 actually, which is why I always looked older than I was. Well, these 4 girls are like this, like that, like that, like that, like organ pipes. So when we went to the Gestapo, my mother leads the group and we're going like this. Her very reluctant co-worker, he says, you'll see, we'll get arrested. My mother said, we can't manage as for what you told me about your nights here and your children being molested. We cannot stay like this. We need help. We have to go there. And this woman was second, and her children, and I bring up the rear because I'm afraid some of them might run away. They're that scared. And my mother had told them. For this we were liberated when she hears the other woman tell her tale. And she tells everybody, you put your best clothes on that you still have. We're going early in the morning. And we do. And she gets there, and there are 2 soldiers with bayonet-mounted rifles, and uniforms, and their uniforms are black like the SS, and that's what they are. They have torn off the epaulettes, there's no German eagle on their chests, but nevertheless, we know these uniforms were worn by SS men. And if you don't know what that is, they were the same as the Gestapo. The Gestapo was with civilian and civilian. By the way, they always wore gray leather coats. That's how you knew you were being watched by the Gestapo, standing at the street corner, which happened, and I saw that. The SS was the same in the army, and they were the enforcers, and if a soldier didn't want to shoot Jews, then he was in trouble. So here we see these uniforms, and what does my mother do? My mother goes like this, Panie, which means Mister. Panie Komwises, expecting us. She says it in German. Most Poles at that time understood German, and most of them spoke it. We're in the building now, and the adjutant, what do we want? We have to speak to your commandant, to Panie Komwisa. Okay, he's somewhat bewildered seeing these seven females in various sizes. And he bids us sit on a very narrow bench opposite the officer's door. He goes in, he comes back, and he sees my mother and me, and we look more together than the other five. So he calls the two of us in. My mother tells her story, and very soon has a laundry list of demands. This guy, before we get too far into it, gets up. We are alone with the commandant. He goes to the door, opens it, looks in the hallway up and down, comes back and whispers to us, I have a Jewish mother too.
Wow.
Something he doesn't dare say out loud, because many Poles were anti-Semites. Not all. We had met a few in our wanderings, and they were slave laborers now free. And my mother said, Judoka, which means a Polish, which means in Polish, I'm a Jewish woman. And it was an embracing all around. 3 of them, 2 of us. We were friends, because now we were free. We were free of the Nazis, of the Germans. And so, not, as I say, not all of them were anti-Semites, and this is part of what I tell the children in the end. They were righteous Germans, they were good people. By the way, I didn't tell you way in the beginning that my father got a baptism certificate for me to prove that I didn't have a Jewish education, which would be helpful if the worst came to the worst. I didn't need it, but that was a pastor who was sympathetic. Just a little sidelight here. So my mother is speaking to this Pole, and he is sympathetic, and she's asking for picture ID, a protective letter. Well, that was what the ID contained. We're not to be molested. All right, so now I'm in this ward, and the nurses notice that I'm getting up, bringing people water as they scream for it, putting their legs back into bed, and they realize this isn't a good place for this young woman. And so they take me, they find a room that has 2 beds in it, which I think used to be for nurses and doctors to take a rest when it was a normal hospital. And so now it's a teenage ward. There were 2 teenagers. And the other one has stories, and we talk to each other. Our tummies are out, so we're playing drums to pass the time and, keeping up our courage and our sense of humor. And we can do that. And what does my mother do? She cannot get to visit. She found a woman who spoke both Polish and Russian, one of the Jewish women. She gives her a soft egg, a roll, for me every day. How she got the food, I have no idea, but she found it. Maybe she had some rings left, because what we were doing was, for one ring once, she got 25, 30 pounds of potatoes. We already had the soup kitchen, but it wasn't enough, so this is one of the ways. Once we were, Poles are very entrepreneurial, and what they could get, you know, they were selling. And we didn't have money, but we did have, my mother had left, she was a collector of rings, so she had quite a few sewn into her clothes. And that was how you bartered after the war. So how she got the food for me, I don't know. This woman got through to the guards, and she could come to the door, so she could convince herself, yes, Eva, my mother must have had a picture of me, yes, Eva is still there, she's still alive, and she would bring that message to my mother, and I had a little bit of food. Because the only food the hospital had was pea soup, which is the last thing you need when you have a disease that has you bloated. And for the worst ones, mashed potatoes, which I don't know if they were real or what, because we already had, there was already a little bit of artificial food, like, maybe I shouldn't call them artificial, but dry food. Like later on in the DP camp, we had milk powder and egg powder, and that's what we were given there. But this is still back in Danzig. And I get out of the hospital. The last thing they did for us, we could take a shower. I think there was a shower. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe it was a bath. But we could get really cleaned up. And we needed a shampoo against lice, because if we didn't have them when we got in, I didn't. We caught them there from the other people. So I'm not sure that we both had it, but to be sure that we wouldn't take it out to the population, we were given this shampoo. The next day we got out. I have no memory of how I got back to my mother, because I wasn't strong enough to walk very far, but somehow we did. There were no, you have to remember, no phones, no mail, no nothing. Everything you wanted to communicate was on foot or on a building, like I told you before. So anyhow, I was now back in our temporary home. My father had come back from France, walking most of the way, occasionally catching a freight train. And the freight trains could only run wherever the rails were not interrupted. So he would be on a train maybe for an hour, and then jump off and walk to the next area. And before he did that, he too was emaciated, mostly bones. He spent the first 4 weeks of freedom. I think some of it, the war wasn't even over, but the Germans had left, and they had gone east to be in Germany when the war ended. You know, they didn't want to be in a slave labor camp caught by, it would have been the French actually, because the French, well, it could have been the British also, whoever, you know, if one of the allies that now won the war with the help of Americans. So they left, and they asked some of the Jews who were there, how many of you know how to drive a car? Because not all of them did. because cars were still a novelty in those days, in the 40s. Doctors had them, and what the officers in the army had was drivers, but there were not enough of those. So anyhow, they asked for drivers. And one of our friends, my friend's father, as a matter of fact, knew how to drive. And so he drove home. He drove as far east as he could, and then walked the rest so he could be in Danzig with his wife. What happened to them? They were taken prisoner by the Russians. This guy was blonde and blue-eyed. He was a German. Not all Germans were. You know, Germans had the same colorations as my uncles and aunts. They were brunette and red-haired and blondes. There weren't that many blonde Germans because over the centuries there were always wars and people walking by, you know, and there were no pure Aryans in Germany, but Hitler and his people didn't want to know that, so they made up racial stories, which is besides the point. So anyhow, I found my father at home, in our temporary home. He did not believe my mother when she said Eva's in the hospital. He thought she was trying to let him down easy. But now, of course, I was there, alive. But my hair had lost its color saturation. I was skinny. I wasn't the girl he remembered. So that was hard for him. What he was able to do in those months that we were still there was one of his friends who had one Jewish parent, which was coincidence. The two of them got jobs like I told you, the Poles were entrepreneurs. They started a theater group. And my father and this young man, both of whom looked pretty good, even though they were skinny by this time. Everybody was skinny, the actors too. They could be in the crowd scenes, you know, where you murmur some sounds. You don't have to speak Polish. And they were also, my father was partially an artist. What he did for work included some art. This room doesn't have any of his paintings, but there is one of my grandchildren. No, they were my children. When my children were little, my father made a portrait of them. So what he did was to paint the scenery for the theater, and the two of them were extras. So he found a little bit something to get a few Polish złotys was the word for that. And my mother continued being president. He was also flabbergasted. He left my mother as a woman who never had a job, who was a housewife. He had no idea that this was in her, that she had the strength to convince this Pole that yes, and we needed what we needed, and you know, that we had food and that she was presiding. That was all very strange to him. But I was home now, and we were getting some cans from an organization in the United States, the Joint Distribution Center, and my mother organized, after I became strong enough. At first I could hardly walk, but I did walk, and I found some of my friends, and I continued to write more of these, probably these IDs. I'm not sure about that. I know a meal that I cooked for my father and one of his friends, and that was a cabbage. It's kind of a green cabbage, this size. We cut it in four. We had fish oil, every now and then rumors were going around. You can get some caramel sugar that had been burned, and it was like caramel, like candy really. But it had some food value, and I would go and bring that home. And so also fish oil. So I had this fish oil, I had a frying pan, and this cabbage was split in four, and I sautéed it, and that was a meal. There was nothing else. I don't think at that point, well, maybe there was a slice of bread, I'm not sure about that. But it was just a major meal. You know, if you don't know what you're eating, make believe it tastes like chicken. And they were very happy with that, and I had made it. And to cook, there was no gas, there was no fuel, there was no electricity. We had candles. This was an old coal hearth. We had plenty of wood. If you had an axe, you had wood, because so many buildings were burnt down, were ruins, there were wooden beams, and maybe with some help of some of the guys in the building, because I can't imagine my mother, in the little time she had at home, could go and carry a beam home, or that I could do that once I came home. Maybe my father was helpful, so, you know, once he came home. So that's what we had. I had to take the axe and make, and I still have a scar from where I hit my thumb, and make wood, to make a wood fire in order to cook. But that's a small point. So my mother now organized a Red Cross train. I never asked how she managed to do it, she did it. And everybody who was like us, who wanted to come, if their husbands had found their way home, some of them did, like my father, could come with us on that train. The train was going west, of course. And we did that. But there's something else. Before I got sick, while we were now living, something happened. We were out in the streets, and we hear a French song, and we see French prisoners of war who were able to walk. Some of them had been wounded, but those who were able to walk with and without bandages, they were going west. As the slave laborers were coming east to find their families, these people were going west. And they were singing a song, and the two words we understood that we picked up were "Guerre finie, guerre finie." This is 2 months after our experiences, 1 month after we have a place to live. It was actually a day after the war was over. It was May, VA Day, I think it's May 8th.
I think so.
This was May 9th. And 6 weeks after we had our apartment. And so we were very happy also, because the war was over. Now, one of those Frenchmen later on was part of the group with which we went into the, obviously he had been wounded and wasn't well enough to walk with these marchers. So he was on our Red Cross train in our group. We arrived in Berlin in the American quarter, and we were being interviewed before we could be let into the rest of the American quarter in the country of what used to be Germany. Berlin was its own, was the four allies had quarters in Berlin. But before we could go to the rest of West Germany, we had to pass an interrogation. This was an OAS man. We come into his office. He's sitting at a desk with his feet on the desk. And my mother tries to tell him who we are. He takes his feet off the desk. I don't know if it was out of respect for us, or was it just more convenient? Because he says, how can I believe you are a German Jew? You might have had an SS, a Nazi husband, and he gave you this passport. So my mother pulls out the picture of her father's tombstone, says the prayer. She has no idea this man is Jewish, but it happens to be he is Jewish and he understands the Hebrew prayer. And he says, my mother says she has 2 brothers in America. Oh, does she know the address? She knows the address of the one in Brooklyn. Oh, but you write it down for me? Oh my God, this is where my parents are, right in that neighborhood. They're just 3 blocks away. And when I send a courier's bag to the United States, I always have a letter to my parents in it, and they get it. He gave her a piece of paper. If you can write a few words to your brother and put his address on it, my parents will send it to your brother. And the brother had a sister-in-law who was in the WACS. Remember the WACS?
Yes.
The Women's Army Corps, which my grandchildren, if they listen to this, might not know. But there was such a thing, and some of them were stationed in Germany. And she was stationed in the American zone. All of them were, I guess. The Brits had their own ATS, they were called. And I don't know what the French had, because the French had lost the war, but they did have a zone of Germany. But so what happens? So this man, first of all, he lets us go. And by the way, in the corner of his office are 2 men with no shirts on and their arms up. They're standing like little boys who were naughty in class, facing the wall. And my mother is what's with them, and he tells that they were found to be SS men, and I guess he didn't know yet what was to be done with them. What they did, they had 2 lightning signs tattooed into their. It hurts me to talk about it. Into the what do you call this? The armpit. That has to be painful, but they had that. And after the war, or towards the end of the war, they obviously after the war. They couldn't do that before the war ended. They would have been in danger themselves. They had them operated out. But the operation left scars, and you could still see they had those tattoos. And
So let me ask, how did you find your way to the United States?
well, that's why you just really heard most of that story already, because you now know that my uncle is going to find out that we are going to be in the American zone. And what does that mean? We're getting there within the next few days. By the way, my parents divorced at that point because the marriage had been fragile already. And it was when we arrived in Berlin that my father said, "You don't need me anymore." And he had a sweetheart, and we had to stay a little longer in the American zone rather than get on a ship, because my mother had to see the divorce through. She figured that she might meet somebody, and she knew he wanted to get remarried, and she did that. And he proved his character by taking on the slave labor at the time, and they had had a good marriage up to a certain point. So of course she did that. But we are now going, and there's a whole group of us, and we are traveling together, and we are arriving in the town of Frankfurt, Main, the big town of Frankfurt Main, and it's not far from the Rhineland. Was probably part of it, I'm not that sure anymore. In any case, what they had for us was displaced persons camp. By the time we crossed the border, by the way, it's interesting, it's the 11th of November in 1945. Does the 11th of November means nothing to you?
Veterans Day.
Okay, but it used to be called Armistice Day. And it was Armistice Day in Europe, it still is. We renamed it Veterans Day. So to me, that was the end of World War I, and to me that was very important, that that's the day we crossed the border. And we were now free, because until then, there were Soviet Union, and we did not feel comfortable till we were on German soil under American occupation. So we were in this DP camp, and one day, and by the way, we had food there. We were friends of all these people with whom we had traveled. Some of them were partisans. The two that knew about our apartment had a girl cousin, and we were all good friends. So it was not a bad situation. The barbed wire that had once been on those camps had been taken down because, I don't know if you know, that Eisenhower was very upset with what was going on. He was very upset when he saw concentration camps that were being liberated, and he had somebody make photos and videos, some people who were in the army, photographers, that none of this should be forgotten. And when the deniers were talking and people like me came out and wanted to tell our stories, that's how all that came about. It was to prove that yes, it happened. And we showed, when I was talking to school children, in a large group, we had those videos to show. And I think it's important to mention that now. So my uncle in Brooklyn had a sister-in-law who was in the wax. He wrote to her, Trudy is in one of these camps with Eva, and you will find them. And their name is Lehman, Gertrude Lehman and Eva Lehman. And so what she did was, one of her young friends who was also in uniform, she went to these in a Jeep, which this younger woman knew how to drive. She went to the DP camps and she arrived in ours. We were in our room, large room, all 9 of us with the French soldier were in this room. And one excited woman who had met my mother and knew her name came running. Frau Lehmann, there is this rock standing on a Jeep and she's calling your name. And we, of course, were out of there like a shot and met Tilly. Tilly Sperling was her name. And she was like a ray of sunshine, because there was still no mail. We did not know, did my uncle get the message from the OAS man. Obviously he did, we knew that now, and a connection was made. And through her, he was able to provide the visa, which they hadn't been able to provide before the war, because most of our friends had left. But most of our friends had more money than we had. And that's what you needed, because one of those friends told my mother as they were saying goodbye, why didn't you bribe the officials, the Americans? Well, we didn't have that kind of money, and my mother was, and my grandfather, by the way, were the kind of Germans who were very correct. You do everything within the limitations of the law. So it wouldn't even occur to her that she could bribe. My father, who was an actual German, and by the way, German Jews considered themselves Germans. They served in the army. My grandfather had the Iron Cross. He had been in World War I, as I think I told you in the beginning. But my father was of a different kind, you know. He knew that you had to do whatever it took to survive. My mother learned it the hard way, but she never really learned it. She always stayed this proper German that people in Israel, for instance, used to laugh about. But okay, so now we know the connection has been made, and we do get the visas. We could have gone on earlier on the first refugee ship. We don't, because my mother has to see the divorce through, and I have made a new friend who also got out of Germany. And what she did, she came to the DP camp to pick up some food. When they were getting food from the States, she qualified. They didn't live there. Their apartment had been spared. They were in a building. They had saved their Jewish father in a very unique way, which I may not have time to tell you about. But this is near the end of the story, and we do get out on the 3rd, and we get picked up at the pier by this uncle and his family. They have a little 9-month-old girl who gets car sick, so we have to stop on the way to Brooklyn. He picks us up with his car, and we are all squeezed in. And then my mother wants to share a few things, and they say, oh, we don't need to know. You are here now. Forget about the war. The people we left behind, no, we didn't leave anybody behind. The people who were left behind in Germany when the war started, every one of them was taken to a concentration camp and killed. My grandmother, who was the widow of a war hero, this Jewish man who had been a war hero, it took them a little longer. They had a building that became an old age home. It had been a Jewish hospital. And she was there, and then some months after the war started, maybe a year or two later, she was sent to the concentration camp Terezin or Theresienstadt, which many Americans have heard about. It was the place that was shown to the Swiss Red Cross as, see how good we keep the Jews. This is it's like a spa. It's a beautiful place. It had been a beautiful place when it was part of Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic. And every time the Swiss Red Cross came, the elderly and the sick, the weak people were sent out to a concentration camp. And by the time my grandmother got to be 77, she was too. My mother had a dream at that time. This is sometime in early 44, I would think. She had a dream that she sees her mother, and her mother is screaming, "Trudy, help me, help me." And 1 week later, she gets a postcard from this concentration camp, the only one that could send postcards out. and also the only one that could get every 3 months a Red Cross package. In this postcard, your mother went on a trip, which was code for she was transported. So she knew that the day she dreamt that was my grandmother's last breath. They gassed them. And on that postcard, this man is saying, could you send me these Red Cross packages you sent to your mother? I don't know if she did or didn't. I never asked. And unfortunately, I only thought to ask when it was too late. That's also with my father, and did he build, fortifications was the word I couldn't think of at the time. Did he build some of those huge fortifications? Did he have to work on those? It is very likely, but I don't know some of the answers, and my parents are no longer with us. But in any case, we were now in Brooklyn. By the end of that summer, I had one summer in summer school in New Jersey. Friends of ours took me so I could have an idea of American schools. But when Labor Day came around, my mother had found us a room in New Jersey and a job, because on one job she couldn't live, and she also didn't think that after surviving the war together we should be separated. So I started to work. It was very simple work. I went to night school. Who did I meet in night school? Night school was in Manhattan, so it was a complicated trip to get there, and those 2 nights I spent in night school, I was able to get a meal for 99 cents, a whole meal in a cafeteria, with a drink and a meal, and then back to New Jersey. So it was pretty hard for me, but I was out of Europe, which my mother said we could have lived probably an easier life in Germany.